Ladies and gentlemen, what is baffling is that those who used to have voices on these things seem to have lost their voices. People speak on issues based on who is in power. It's our definite silence suggesting that we are no longer concerned about issues that we complained about yesterday. The molestation and, in some cases, assassination of journalists, murder of MPs, corruption, the harassment of agents. We have just finished another election, the 8th in the series since the beginning of our Fourth Republic democratic experiment. As usual, the accolades came from all over the corners of the world, and we took them with pride, as we should. But we failed to tell the world, what we failed to tell the world is that some people lost their lives in the course of the election. Ladies and gentlemen, for me, no election is as important as to warrant the loss of even one life. And the silence over it is numbing, as it gives the impression that it is okay and it is to be expected. No, it is not to be expected. It is not okay. Let me say that one of the saddest moments for me was after the State of the Nation address, when a prominent MP was asked why there had not been serious outpouring of grief about the death of the innocent people in Techiman. His response was that, as far as he was concerned, they were undeserving of any sympathy because he saw them as armed robbers. For me, that was a new low for the country. We also witnessed, arguably, the biggest assault on our democracy since the beginning of the Fourth Republic. When on the eve of the swearing-in of the president, at a time when there were no ministers, and crucially, let me repeat, crucially, there was no Minister of Defense. Armed soldiers, that is to say, officers from an institution that works by command, invaded our parliament, and up to date, no serious answers have been provided. This could have been grave, this could have had grave consequences for the future of our country. Indeed, the last section of the citizenry believe that the judiciary is not impartial, with 85% of Ghanaians in the recent Afrobarometer survey perceiving the judiciary as corrupt and ineffective. My own personal experience with the judiciary is that of frustration, lengthy and costly proceedings. Some lawyers take pride in being masters of legal gymnastics. Every opportunity to delay cases are seized upon. The commercial courts, which were set up to speed up the dispensation of justice, have become a huge disappointment. Disputes involving land overwhelm the courts. Land acquisition is the most important factor, but now I will tell you, in investment decision making. Any prolonged litigation over land frustrates any investor. Indeed, it has been said that the enclave that houses the Lands Commission, Lands Evaluation, and Title Registry, these registries, is arguably the most corrupt enclave in the world. It cannot be good for investment. But corruption pervades all aspects of our governance structure. A few years ago, a prominent member of parliament said publicly that parliamentarians take bribes to pass bills that favor their sponsors. Ladies and gentlemen, if a fish comes out from water to tell us that crocodile has one eye, who are we to doubt it? Incidentally, the said MP is now the Speaker of Parliament, Honorable Alan Barkley. Our governments, all the governments, have paid lip service to anti-corruption, but I'm afraid do very little substantially to cure the canker. Which of the major corruption issues has been conclusively dealt with since the Fourth Republic began? There have been many corruption scandals and none have been conclusively dealt with. I could give you a long list of unresolved corruption cases, but there's no need to bore you with something that we are all familiar with. As a friend of mine would say, the problem with corruption is not the absence of laws, but the certainty of punishment.
So that's Dr. Sam Jonah, and he was speaking at a Rotary Club event. And that speech he gave has become and dominated discussions. There's been some criticism, a lot of it, I must say, at him for that. Let's begin once again with Sulemana. And the aspect where he speaks about, because we cannot talk about everything else that he had to deal with, where he speaks about the culture of silence he talks about academia, civil society, media, that there's a deafening silence and there's bad governance going on. He doesn't say it exactly that way. There's wrong going on. And the people who previously, he seems to suggest, would have been very vocal are not.
Well, Samson, I've had the opportunity of reading the full speech by Sir Sam Jonah, and I think that we need to commend him for giving us a mirror reflection of the situation in our country today and maybe years back. Of course, people would certainly criticize him for one reason or the other, but as I've said, I think that he tried as much as possible to give us a reflection of exactly what is happening in our country. Now, on the issue of culture of silence, of course, he talks about the fact that we are gradually returning to that phenomenon, and the fact that this time it is not something that is being imposed by the military or imposed by any other conditions, but sometimes out of convenience, sometimes out of personal decisions, and sometimes, of course, the fact that speaking the truth these days gets you into a lot of trouble. It may not get you into court, but perhaps even if you were to get to court to defend yourself, sometimes it would have been an easier way than the barrage of accusations, intimidations, threats, and all of that you face, not only on social media, but even sometimes on mainstream media by sponsored agents of one political party or the other. My view is that when you take civil society, I think the country today, if anything at all in terms of our good governance, is resting on civil society. And I commend people like Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, his colleague or our colleague, Kojo Asante at CDD, Franklin Kujo, and others who have demonstrated that goodwill, not just under this government, but previous governments. And we've had a situation where under the NDC, people like Franklin, even myself, were tagged, branded, attacked, and so on. Until date, there are people who tell me that people like you, Manasseh, Franklin, and others contributed to the downfall of the Mahama regime, to the extent that sometimes when you say something that is not going well under this regime, people will come and say, well, you called for it. This is a payback of what you advocated for, and so on and so on. They
say keep quiet and suffer.
Yes. So I think that in the area of civil society, perhaps it is not because I'm defending civil society, because I'm involved, but increasingly I have said to a lot of friends and even people in the media that it appears to me that when it comes to investigations and reporting issues of national development, civil society is perhaps assuming the role of the media in our country. And it is only when civil society bring the issues up after either investigations or reporting that the media then takes it up and then discusses it. So I think Sir Sam Jonah is right in terms of what we are witnessing in the media, the silence and lack of critical reporting in the media. Then, of course, academia, and that's another big area. When we were growing up, and even when we were in the universities, we were reading about different views and different positions, by our professors, by our lecturers, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, if you have people in academia writing, perhaps it is because their party is not in power. And if they are writing at a time when their party is in power, it's all about praises. And in fact, criticizing a government or a group that is no longer in power, that is not controlling our taxes, that is not managing our monies, that is not managing our resources. And these include professors. And then you have those who are out of power and would be commenting because they see everything wrong with the current system. And I don't want to mention names, but I believe that you know what I'm talking about. Persons who then secure positions when their party gets to power. And once their party gets to power, they are mute. Samson, it's the same thing. The same issues that our politicians, on the NPP side, my friend Alassane Suhuyini and his colleagues on the minority side, a lot of the things today they would see as wrong. They were the same people who were defending the same issues when they were in government. And it's the same for the ruling party today. The things that they were criticizing and so on and so forth, today they are mute about it. And so I think Sir Sam Jonah is right on the issue of, institutions and the media being silent. But it is not surprising.
How is he? Okay, finish that point.
It has been something that has been building up. And I think that it's almost exploded under this particular regime, where you have, the murder of a journalist who face severe threats to the point where they have to leave the country. The government prides itself, or people in government say, well, we provided police protection for the journalist. But what was the reason for the police protection? I think that is much more important than the fact that you provided police protection. I don't think that any individual's life can be protected by the mere fact that a person is following the journalist as a police officer or as a security officer. We have had a situation where the NCA has undertaken that politically motivated exercise of shutting down opposition radio stations. In other words, muting opposition voices. And if that is not an exercise, to create an atmosphere of culture of silence, I don't know what that would be. And so you talk to a lot of journalists today, and they will tell you, well, Charlie, I'm afraid. People would call you, including our parents. My mother is not illiterate, but there have been occasions where my mother will call me and say, look, you have to be careful. What we are reading, what we are hearing these days, things are not safe, and therefore you have to be careful. Look, my mother advises me on security tips. My mother, who is sitting in the village,
Sulemana, the things you say and how bluntly you put them, does it matter which regime in which you would have said them that your mother would not be concerned?
Well, I think that my mother will be concerned on the basis of what is happening in the system, what she hears on radio. A journalist has been killed. A journalist has had to leave the country. Another journalist has been arrested. Recently, a journalist working on a story about some incident involving a Council of State member. And then having arranged to meet with this person at a restaurant, the journalist is ambushed, whisked away to the police headquarters and charged with an offense of publicizing or publication of false news of a story that is yet to be published. And one wonders, how can you charge somebody for publishing false news which is yet to be published? And so on and so forth. So certainly if my mother sits in the village and hears about this, of course, she will be concerned about what I say and how I say things.
But how is Sam Jonah right, in absolute terms perhaps, when he suggests the way he puts what he says? The charge against academia. Let's take, for example, we know people like Professor Jampo. He is loud. He speaks about the issues bluntly. We all can testify to that. He's in academia. He contributes. There are other professors like him who have been talking. When the very obnoxious law bill of the Public Universities Bill was being pushed down our throats, the media almost felt this is for the universities, leave it to them. Professors Akosia Domako, Professor Etia Apieje, Professor Raymond Atuguba, they were very loud. Of course, you have professors who are clearly MPP who didn't see anything wrong with it. So academia, can you say they are not speaking? If you come to civil society, you have mentioned HKC Prempeh and many of okay, not too many of them. Professor Kuku Asari. You have mentioned Franklin Kujo. Look at what happened to Domelevo. What didn't civil society do? Talk about the media. What have we not done? When the cathedral matter came, I brought it up. The media full in support. If a government won't listen, what can you do? When the vote to want to do the yes vote came up, I brought it up. There was full support. it was, the president clearly found out that he didn't have support for it. So he shelved it. So what is it that is actually true about the culture of silence that he talks about?
Well, Samson, first of all, I think that even at a time when the culture of silence was something that was agreed to, that, well, we are currently in a situation of culture of silence, I don't think that that meant that society, everybody was silent. I believe that there were people who were speaking up, the PAB says, the Professor Ebibuahins, and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
And therefore, when we talk about the culture of silence, it wouldn't be absolute silence where everybody is quiet. In the context of the academia, you referenced the public universities bill. Yes, they talked about it, but it mustn't be when an issue affects you, that is when you stand up. There are other things that are going on. When the free SHS policy was introduced and was being implemented at the beginning of the first term of this government, if you followed it quite keenly, headmasters who started speaking up and raising voices and expressing concerns about certain aspects of the policy were immediately either transferred or actions taken against them. And eventually what happened was that every headmaster got muted. And it's either you keep quiet, do as we say, or you get yourself into trouble. Now, that would not mean that you wouldn't have headmasters who would voice concerns here or there. If you take the media, yes, people like Manasseh and a few other people, yourself, would continue to raise the critical issue. But it is about the price you pay when you raise those issues. It is out of those publications and those comments that our friend and brother and colleague Manasseh had to leave the country. Nobody would want to leave his own country, under such circumstances. And when you return, you have police officer protecting you. Indeed, if there was nothing, why would the government assign a police officer to protect someone? So it is the price you pay. It is the abuse that is rained on you.
All right. Okay, so I think Sweeney, you will appreciate that because as I mentioned, academia and civil society, they express similar sentiments that we talk, but at a price.
Exactly, Samson. I think I agree with Suleimana when he says that there's a need for people to be reminded of how the phrase came about, culture of silence. That phrase was not coined out of dead silence in this country. That phrase came out of criticisms of the Rawlings regime. People were still publishing the Chronicles, the Daily Mails, the opposition news outlets. It was the time that Haruna Atta and Malik Kwekubako and others were taken to prison because we had the criminal libel law then. But that was the point, that was the time the culture of silence was set to be in existence. Indeed, it was a time even demonstrations like the Kumipreku and others before them were organized. So when you speak of the return of culture of silence now, and people point to, maybe the academia in the university bill and some media houses still criticizing government, as if to say that it is evidence enough that culture of silence is not returning, then I think it is that kind of argument is based on a very myopic understanding of what culture of silence actually represents. And so it's important that, we understand how that phrase came about. And so if people who lived it are beginning to tell us about its return, we must be paying attention, even if we do not understand what it was like to live under the culture of silence then. We must take from the wisdom of those who lived it. Because you see, Sam Jonah is not the first person to have spoken of the possible return of culture of silence. You recall that even in the closure of radio stations, around that time, these discussions were had. Haruna Atta, who lived it, who paid, in some cases, what you can describe at the time as the ultimate price, going to jail, also warned and expressed concern that we seem to be going back to the culture of silence. These are people who lived it. And so when they are telling you, it is based on what they felt then and how they are feeling now. So, Samson, I'm sure we will get to that.
On the closure of the stations,
yes,
a section of you felt the media was not discussing the matter enough.
Absolutely. Samson, I'm sure we'll get to that. Last week, I made reference to this publication by the Freedom House. And I'll just, with your permission, quote my favorite part of this article. Okay. It is actually in the introduction,
right,
where it says that in some parts of the world, the threats to press freedom are explicit and often violent. Journalists are murdered or imprisoned. States maintain strict media monopolies, and domestic audiences are cut off from foreign news sources. Such unambiguously hostile conditions typically elicit strong responses from international advocacy groups and democracies that are committed to defending freedom of expression. Now, this is the catch. However, in much broader range of countries, governments are using the more subtle tools of media regulation to restrict press freedom, maintaining a veneer of legality and pluralism that is less likely to draw attention or criticism from abroad. Manipulation of the regulatory framework allows leaders to either tolerate or rein in influential news outlets depending on the political situation, and permits even democratically elected governments to fortify themselves against future electoral competitions. So for me, when those shutdowns were happening, this kept ringing in my head. And so when I heard Harun Atai and Co. talk about the return of culture of silence even before Sir Sam Jonah, I thought that colleagues in the media should have been more angry, should have been more vociferous in the defense of the right to continue to freely express ourselves, especially through these media platforms that were under attack. Clearly, I think that Sir Sam Jonah said nothing wrong and said nothing new, nothing that we are not all aware of. He spoke about the economy. He spoke about the debt burden that we all know about, and any businessman should be worried. Any investor looking at the debt burden, looking at, how much we are using to pay for a compensation and interest, would be worried. He spoke about gold mining, not just the devastating effects of Galamsey as a result of the bond fight against it, but also because he has managed that industry before and knows how South Africa used to earn from gold and where they are placed today and why we should not put our hopes only in that, resource. He spoke about oil and the world moving towards green energy and why we seem to not be having a discussion around how we possibly can replace this oil or still continue to get money when the world finally moves to green energy. He spoke about cocoa and the risk associated with it. So what exactly did he do wrong? He spoke about the judiciary, backing it with data from the recent Afrobarometer survey that shows that people do not have confidence in the judiciary. They do not think they are impartial, and they do not also think that, they think that they are corrupt, 85% of them. So what exactly did Sir Sam Jonah say wrong? What did he say in the whole presentation that anybody has been able to point out that this is wrong?
The people in the NDC are running with it and suggesting, more particularly to civil society, the religious, and the media, that when it's Akufo-Addo or NPP, you are soft, or either you are bought, But when it's NDC, and they will remind us all the time that, remember what you did to John Mahama.
Yeah.
You are not doing even a quarter of that in this regime.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Something to some extent, I agree with it. You see, I remember when I joined politics and I was asked why I chose the NDC. I said, after practicing as a journalist and dealing with the wrath of the NPP and the NDC, I decided to choose a political party that we all feel comfortable criticizing in this country, because I cherish the freedom of expression, because I believe it is in such dialogues and criticisms that we get better as a country. It is not appropriate for all of us to become yes men. We will become stagnant as a people when we all become yes men. So, and like I said, in the media, I faced the wrath of the NPP and I faced the wrath of the NDC, and I chose one that I thought was more accommodating of criticism, more tolerant of criticism. And I believe it is that tolerance of criticism, and that's not to say the NDC has been perfect. You still have, you know, excesses here and there. But generally speaking, I believe that the NDC tend to be more tolerant and more accommodating of dissent and criticism. And it is, I believe, the reason why the voices are at the crescendo when the NDC is in power, because people feel comfortable enough to criticize and still get a pat on the shoulder from those that they criticize.
Okay.
Unlike what happens, especially under this NPP government. You see, something I keep talking about, the difference between this NPP government and the MPP governments that we have seen. This particular one, it's like none we have seen.
Okay, Panka, let me get to you, and then after that we'll get Oliver to also share his views. I was using a certain example recently that in 2016, when there was an attempt to pass what we became known as a spy bill, okay, interception of postal packets, we did representations, criticizes. There was civil society, there was the Telecoms Chamber, there was the Ghana Bar Association, and a couple others. The committee in Parliament responsible invited those of us who had written, you know, position papers to appear. I appeared with two other entities, the Telecoms Chamber and I think one other thing. We made our representations. And later, James Agaga, who was Deputy Minister of Defense, sat on this platform. Interior, sat on this platform and said, we withdrew the bill because of the representations you people made. And he particularly singled me out. Guess what? That same bill, with, if you like, no difference, was repackaged as Cybersecurity Act bill. I raised issues about the outstanding matters. The minister called me, said, you know, we'll have a meeting, we'll discuss them. It never happened. It is now law. It is in that bill, it is in that law that people who may threaten other people with
unregistered,
you know, no, giving their, if I take nude your picture, nude picture, and I threaten you that if you don't give me money, I will blackmail as extortion. They can go to jail for 1 year or 3 years, and if they actually did it, they can go to jail for between 10 to 25 years. In that, the telcos, for example, one of our criticism at the point with the telcos was that they should not be burdened with doing the capability to be able to monitor the conversations. That thing is still there. A police officer can actually instruct a telco to monitor me without first going to a court. These things are still there in that law. I raised it. Nobody is interested. Do you think I will think what he says is correct or not?
First of all, let me start by saying that if you come to that conclusion, based on what he has said, you will be wrong.
Why?
That law that you talk about, which has been passed, was passed by the Parliament of Ghana, not MPP members of Parliament.
Please, this you know what you are saying. You know
it was passed by the Parliament of Ghana. Again, Samson, I don't know whether you've been able to take the hazard to look at the contributions of the people from both sides of the House when this bill was brought to Parliament to be debated and passed into law. You know very well that laws are made in most cases to fill a lacuna which has been created as a result of practice over time. Now, if within a certain context, geography or time, you find that there's the prevalence of a certain act or a certain deed in society which is generating a lot of controversy and spreading like wildfire and destroying the fiber of society. As a responsible government, you regulate by coming out with certain laws that will regulate impunity and make sure that people are punished to serve as deterrence to those who engage in such acts. Because for me, those acts became so pronounced within a certain period, within the period 2014, 15, 16, up until now.
The point I'm making by my question is this.
Yes.
You may have heard people like Dennis Ajay,
yes,
who says this law is completely unconstitutional. The point I'm making is that when it was being brought under the NDC, there were voices against it. Did you hear any voices against it when it was being done under the NPP? That's my question.
No, but those voices...
The telecoms chamber wrote, campaigned in the media, went to Parliament to make a point. The Ghana Bar Association wrote, campaigned, but didn't make a representation in Parliament, but their views were heard. Have you heard them?
You see, that is where I wanted to even start my argument from, or my presentation this morning from. You see, there is a certain dangerous conclusion that I've heard from commentators on this issue of culture of silence. First, let me ask a fundamental question, and let's debate it from there. That what is the historical meaning of culture of silence in the context of our Ghanaian media freedom
You're
and
not
practice?
answering my question.
I'm coming to that.
You're not answering my question.
I'm coming to that.
The same things that we were against are in this new thing. Nobody has spoken about this one.
Samson, haven't you indicated?
How do you explain that? Does it not feed into the perception that this is what is going on?
Haven't you indicated that you made effort to make an input?
I did publicly.
Haven't you indicated that?
As a Lone Ranger.
And again, did you go the next mile to ensure that when you were not given a hearing, as you have indicated, did you go the next step to ensure that you took other actions that would draw attention to it? Did you do that? And did anybody threaten you not to do it? That's the question. And those that did not make representation as they made earlier, is there any indication that they were afraid of any threat, real or imagined, on the part of anybody? That's why they didn't do it? No. There is no indication like that. Nobody has any evidence except blanket conclusions that we have run in order to actually impugn the integrity of the government without basis whatsoever.
You are saying,
I am saying this because...
You're saying by parity of reason,
yes,
that if you had an NDC government that was repeating a law that they had fought against and it withdrew it, would have been quiet again and watch it.
That I would know. That I would know. And that's why I'm saying that if you look at the argument being made, it is as though if anybody had made an advocacy for it to be dropped, etc., the person would, certain actions would be taken against the person. So let's keep quiet at the risk of and peril of our life or work. That cannot be correct. You see, we are not running a utopian society. We are running a realistic society governed by rules and regulations. But I'm beginning to realize that people think that we can have 100% perfection in all facets of life. It is impossible to have that anywhere on earth. There may be isolated cases of threats to journalists, and they will continue to be same in 100 years to come. There may be those isolated cases, but to use those isolated cases, maybe 1 or 2 out of 1,000, to run into a certain conclusion is very dangerous. Because culture of silence, I recall growing up that there were occasions when people were doing morning show, and right after the morning show, they were handcuffed from there. Samson, handcuffed from the morning show.
You know, I
to
hate
police.
to do this. I hate to do this.
Hold it.
But it is important because of this example that he gave. Are you aware that a journalist has been picked up and charges filed against him because of a story he intended to do.
That's what Suleiman spoke about.
The WhatsApp story.
You see, hold on,
please.
Hold on, my brother. Let me make my point. I am talking about the context. You have cited an isolated case, and that's why I'm saying that.
Isolated. I can give you countless number of cases.
You are talking about.
Sorry.
I don't do that. It confuses my thought when you do that. You see, if we are going to take a few cases and then come to certain conclusive determinations and call government names, we will also be asking ourselves certain questions. Whether we have any evidence that most of those other things that happen to these journalists are state-sponsored. Do we? And I think the answer is an emphatic no. Because the state will not sponsor people to attack, threaten, and kill a journalist and provide him with security to protect him. That would be ridiculous and ironical. So, for me, as we evolve and develop, we should take notice of the progress we are making and consolidate. Because, look, I heard him loud and clear. And it appears to me that the Venerable Sesam Jonah is using the culture of silence in a certain context other than what we know it to be. Because I rather think that there is the culture of excessive noise today. The Suhinis speak and they are free to walk around. They've never complained. My brother Suleiman Briamah has been very critical of government in certain policies that it has brought. He's never told us, even though he said the mother was warning him, he's never told us that any time, anywhere, his life has been under threat. He's not said so. Hasn't he been speaking? Imani, haven't they been speaking? My brother Franklin Kujo and
Kofi
Bentel and Brad Simmons, they are all over. They have been speaking every day. They have not told us a single day that on the basis of opinion expressed yesterday or the day before, government and agencies have come after them and they are harassing them. None said so. So if a person or group of persons decide to be quiet, it does not mean that there are policies and programs in place to suppress and muscle them into silence. It doesn't mean so. So it is unfortunate that people are running into those conclusions against government. Look, one of the champions of freedom in our democracy, without dispute in our history, has been His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. You cannot write the history of Ghana in terms of advocacy for press freedom, advocacy for return to democracy, without the mention of His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. And it cannot be under his government that he will preside over a situation where there is deliberate state orchestration to silence the masses or the population so that whatever happens, however the ills, they can perpetuate without any check. It cannot be true. So again, Samson, why are we silent about the laws? Go and check the records in Parliament. In the Fourth Republic, laws that ensure media freedom and ensure freedom of persons to express themselves and etc. No regime has promulgated such laws than the government of Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. No regime. The right to information, the Governance Act, special prosecutor, and many of the laws, anti-corruption laws that are there. And if you feel aggrieved by a certain conduct of government, you go for a determination in court. We are not doing that. And we are just running commentary, sometimes without any basis.
There's a section
trying to paint the government with a certain color.
Tell you that this attempt to quickly say go to court is also one of the problems. Let's go to Oliver. Oliver, so Sam Jonah, was he real? And what he said, is it your circumstance?
So something, I think I want to make, if you allow me, 4 points regarding generally this issue. First of all, I think we all need to take a breather and recognize, as some have said, that the phrase culture of silence has a loaded historical meaning in our political context. And acknowledging how that historical burden weighs on this conversation is important. Perhaps that might explain for one part the emotive reactions to that phrase. Secondly, we need to understand that a culture of silence is a maturing process and not a one-off event. It accumulates over time and perhaps becomes amplified at certain critical moment. So in discussing a particular culture, the antecedents often transcend the time spectrum within which we are looking to assess that culture. I think the language of culture itself implies that it's something systemic rather than one-off event. And so to say, where is your proof of culture, is a very difficult thing to give one-off and single-handed event examples of. Now, thirdly, the third point I want to make is that we should not fail to recognize the role that COVID-19 has played in demobilizing activism and the street-based nature of our unique protest culture. So the existing public health emergency has, for right or wrong, or perhaps to some extent, been instrumentalized to de-amplify demonstrations. When you take all the previous administrations under the Fourth Republic, our protest culture found its best expression when it poured out onto the street. In that regard, people's disaffection was visible and was not consigned to the silos that social media produces. So that street-based protest that we have lost is perhaps also compounded the feeling that we are not being heard when we speak. Now, finally, and perhaps the most substantive point is that we have become so, one could say that we have become so engulfed in the definitional question of what constitutes a culture of silence that we are missing the full range of concerns that some Jonah raised. My sense, however, is that the problem does not arise simply because we are engaged in a definitional debate per se, but the problem is that the nature of that debate is so narrow that we are left with an impoverished appreciation of the multiple factors that form the kind of culture he was hinting at. So you could say that the impoverished nature of the debate perhaps has something to do even with the historical baggage of the word. But let me give you a reason why we should pause a little longer on the word culture in this context. And I know that this is not the first time the word culture has caused difficulties for people in this country. A couple of years ago, some feminist advocates and male allies were using the word rape culture to describe a silent pandemic that was happening in this country, and people were losing their minds over it. Your take today, when we began, you were talking about thousands of minors who are being defiled or statutorily raped, as some jurisdictions call it. So, and yet no one is talking about it sufficiently. That is what the culture implies. It's a silent pandemic which is not sufficient attention is not being given to. Now, when I hear the culture of silence in this case, I think I can pick up 4 significant but different aspects of the culture of silence which people are messing up in the debates. We have first a procedural, we have a substantive, we have sociological and recognitional. And I don't want to get academic about it, but the procedural aspects of the culture of silence, perhaps this is the part which has been the most debated, because people are expecting to see a National Liberation Council type prohibition of rumor decree or preventive detention act, or maybe the newspaper license laws or PNDC law 211. They are expecting perhaps routine abductions, torture, abuse of journalists for one reason or the other. Now, depending on what position you take, it is possible to be blind to the fact that these things could in fact be happening. Or it is possible you may recognize that, and many people, including journalists, have said that these things are happening and it's only a matter of degree. So this is perhaps, I think we need to ask ourselves here, what will Jesus do? And in my sense, Jesus will ask Thomas, come and put their hands their finger in the wounds and see it for themselves. And let me show you how. If you take the Public Universities Bill, which in my sense was the naked attempt to get academic freedom, so many people talked about it. Some Jonah made reference to the Legon Observer, for instance, which has disappeared. These are critical concerns and fear around academic freedom that was raised. The main question about that bill is, why did the government feel they need to address academic freedom within the context of the bill and try to circumscribe it? That's why you need to interrogate it. Let's take the Imposition of Restrictions Act, which many people have said makes the Prevention of Detention Act looks like child's play. Let's take the Cyber Security Act, which you have talked about, which undermines legitimate privacy rights. So and if you add to it those one-off instances they're referring to, Ahmed Hussein Soale's case, the incident of people who have been picked up, obviously people would begin to feel compounded that this culture is happening. Now the second one is a substantive culture of silence. Now I can give you 3 examples of how we are witnessing substantive culture of silence without even acknowledging it. First, till this day, we are halfway through the year. The people of Sam Trophy substantively deny their voice in the way our government is being run. The president hasn't addressed the issue. The Attorney General hasn't sued the EC on their behalf. The EC hasn't come back to Ghanaians to acknowledge the injustice and set out steps to rectify it. Secondly, you have expressed attempts to undermine the institutions that are supposed to check the executive in the exercise of its powers. People have talked about the circumstances in which people resigned, the level resigned, and even the fact that the government deployed the military to the floor of parliament, all because they lost the common vote for a speaker. You have the instance of the president making appointments to the Council of State in regard of the role of the parliament in the process.
Yes.
And within
there was no government at the time
as well,
no
people
government
are even asking
there was no
themselves,
government.
what is the use of speech if words have no meaning? So you can scream yourself hoarse, and the government is determined to get its way to do so, even if it means breaching the constitution. So, in fact, even when Jima Boyedi came out to speak, the government all but called him a senile old man. So all these situations compound a substantive feeling of silence. I can take the next one, which is the sociological aspect component of the culture of silence.
Sorry, you make a reference to Jima Boyedi coming out to speak. What do you remember is what he said?
So he was talking about the credibility of the government with regard to corruption. And the reason why he was talking about it is the institutions that are supposed to protect the government's attitude towards them is really the credibility of the government on that issue. So it's that attitude towards dissent and institutions that are supposed to check dissent. That's what he was
But he attacked the president more particularly that from the person he had known him up to this point, he thought that President Akufo-Addo has lost it. So is it wrong for somebody else to criticize him?
I'll get to that bit. It's the sociological aspects as I'm talking about, if you allow me. I think anybody that speaks up publicly understands the weight of that responsibility. And that just because you have the right to speak doesn't mean that it cannot be criticized. I mean, speaking up publicly is not a timorous adventure. However, we need to realize that the state holds disproportionate resources to overwhelm any citizen whose speech it disapproves of. It doesn't have to jail you, but there are several ways in which it can come at you, and there's evidence that the states are fairly targeted its critics. And not all of them are in the public domain. So it is a multi-sociological aspect of criticism of the culture of silence. So many times, and this is even anecdotal evidence that people give, that so many times people will call you and talk to you about a government being vindictive, or you should be careful, you're lucky you're not in the country that you're speaking this way. Things like that. You may say, but where's the proof? You're still around. But what we forget is that it creates a mounting psychological burden, and people refuse to speak up. So we fail to appreciate the sociological component of people choosing to self-censure or practicing fearsome, meaning that they have come to a point where they are feeling that Ghanaian affairs are in their fearsome, which for me is a loss to the republic. So those things that we underplay the psychological weight of them, I think creates what I'm calling this sort of psychological elements of the culture.
When people tell you that, Oliver, because you are not in Ghana, that's why you can afford to make the criticisms you make. And they say that to Professor Kweku Asare also. Yeah. And they say that the two of you, more particularly, that you are able to take on the judiciary and lawyers because you don't go to court. And lawyers who go to court and are here in Ghana cannot do that. Is that relative to a particular president's regime, or that is symptomatic of our circumstance?
So I call it sociological because it's symptomatic and systemic. Now, it is not a democracy if people live in such perpetual fear of their elected and appointed representative. It doesn't add up for me that when an invitation for citizenship is extended and you accept the invitation, people are depressing you into becoming a spectator because people have, for good or bad reason, a belief that you would be in the danger of repercussions if you were in the republic. We need to interrogate why people feel that. And that feeling, it's something that we do not talk sufficiently about. So I don't think that if we want to circumscribe culture of silence within a particular political area, we are doing ourselves enough justice and dealing with the problem holistically. But we also have to acknowledge that the feeling becomes amplified in various areas depending on the way in which the government responds to it.
All
and
right.
This is perhaps the recognitional aspect of the culture of silence I want to deal with briefly.
Okay.
So the recognitional part can be from the refusal to even acknowledge the problem, or to extend a hand to listen to why so many citizens feel this way. If the organizing logic of government is for it to listen to its citizens, then I think the government has so far failed in its responses. I mean, this is something former President Akufo picked up on in his recent public comments when he said, we need to have a dialogue with Sam and to understand why he has that view. And this is the aspect of government that has been so poorly abdicated. The government is not listening. Let me give you an example, historical example. When a lot of people point to Eduboah's speech as culture shifting in some regard, we say that he broke Ghana's culture of silence. But what we often underemphasize is the fact that the person who used the term return of the culture of silence was in fact Chairman Rawlings himself. This was since April 1987, when he was saying that the conduct of many high government officials vis-a-vis the public was a culture of silence. That same month, E.A. Hazel, who was the executive director of the National Commission of Democracy, was saying that the NCD was going to launch a program on public education, and in his work, quote, to break the culture of silence that has struck the majority of Ghanaians. This was in 1987, way before, about a year before Edu Boahen spoke. So the government, if we have the military government itself recognizing the problem and opening the door for recognizing the problem, and I think the government needs to adopt a certain attitude about engaging people rather than feel the need, where is your proof, I need to challenge you, and have to have that reflex of, to attack, an attack reflex rather than a listening reflex. That's one of the things I would say.
Okay.
The last point about the recognitional element, sorry again for holding you.
It's okay, it's okay.
I feel like I need to talk about this.
It's all right.
It's the gendered element of the culture of silence. And a lot of women advocates have talked about how people continue to use words like ashawo and other unprintable words vis-a-vis women who have a dissenting view or elect to participate in our conversation. You have talked about consistently trying to get women onto the platform, and women not wanting to do it because of the blowbacks of it. And we do not talk about this sufficiently enough. Last year, Professor Ekuya Adomagom and wrote a piece where they were raising the prospect of taking culture of silence, using the Public Universities Bill as an example in that case. It didn't even make a ripple. Some Jonah says it. We have think pieces, panel discussions. We group a panel of all men to talk about it. And then sometimes we have a sprinkling of women who are participating in some policy conversation. Right. So I think that salient angle of a gender element of the culture of silence also needs to be appreciated.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. You want to make a small point? I'm coming. I'll give you just a minute or two, and then we take a break. And then, Suleimana, if you feel like you want a minute or something to make a point, just draw my attention. But let me share these views with you, and then take a break. Tony says that until we start blaming Parliament as a body for passing poor laws, members of Parliament will get off by blaming the executive and the party in power. MPs should be cited for their individual and collective action in passing bad laws. This will unite Parliament to serve as a counterbalance and check on the executive. Kweku Enchibuesiako says, my brother, there is not a single person in Ghana today who, in my view, will command a unanimous support of every Ghanaian or political persuasion for any national appointment. Not even Jesus or Muhammad will achieve consensus support across the political divide. We just have to agree to disagree and move on oftentimes. Then, to some of the messages that you have sent via Twitter. This one from Papa J Jr. He says the appointment of Kissie Jabing is just a political move. He's not coming to do anything beneficial for Ghanaians in fighting corruption, but rather to come and serve his political god. Collins Little Tete says, can he do the work? The criteria set for the office should be made clear. Any entanglement tied around Kissie Ejabing. Okay, I think I just lost that. Let me get it. It says, any entanglement tied against Kissie Ejabing. I've lost that message. I'll go look for it. Yeah, it says, any entanglement tied against Kissie Ejabing should be scrutinized to decide or not if he is eligible for the role. Big Boss says, ABK Amidu should not be our yardstick in selecting the next special prosecutor because he was a monumental failure and a disappointment in that office. He spent 3.5 years issuing epistles and complaints rather than pursuing corrupt persons in Ghana. So let's look beyond him. Tanko Osman says, I don't want to mention names. Fit in the hypocrisy described by Sir Sam Jonah. Men are no more bold to call out people. Kofi Amwa says it makes sense to use Anas's men instead of his principal as promised because nothing came out of the principle that hooked Charles Bisu. But for FIFA Nyantechi mentioning his name would have also been swept away. Anas men make the money, and his principle makes the shame. I'll take this last batch of your messages on Twitter. Sita Muhammad says apart from Woyomi, which other corruption case was successfully prosecuted by Martin Amidu prior to his appointment as special prosecutor? One can have the biggest experience of appointment, but what's the achievement? Then iFook says, the only person I want to hear on Kissie Jabin's appointment now is Anas Aremeyao Anas. Prince Henry in Koforidia says, nobody is against the qualifications of Mr. Kissie Jabin, but what we are talking about is his integrity in terms of occupying the special prosecutor's office. Looking at the role he played in defending the Ejapa deal, and that's it again. What has he done on Ejapa deal? Kissie Jabin is not on the Ejapa deal. Let's make that clear. When Amidu was the special prosecutor. Yes, it's true that Amidu in his letter suggests that there are cases in the special prosecutor's office which Kissie Jabin is involved by way of he being a lawyer for somebody. And we will know very clearly, he doesn't mention the cases, but we know that Anas's cases have gone to special prosecutor. If they go there, his lawyer will go there. But if there's any other beyond that, then maybe Martin Amidu may have us know. Okay, so we take a break here. We return. I take the small points that some of my guests want to make, and then we go into the matter of the broadcasting bill. We'll be right back.